Greetings, everyone. Dr. Brian Scott with you. We are studying another podcast session today on the end times and where we are on God's end time timetable. And we're getting closer and closer to the end. We started these podcasts in 2020 in the month of March, so we're about 18 months into continuous podcasts, and things have changed drastically in the world over that short period of time, and we've seen a lot of things happening that are indicators of the very end. So it's as if there's a checklist, and they're just being checked off one after another, and soon that checklist is going to run out, and we're going to be in those last number of years called the tribulation period. We as believers do not want to be here. We want to be raptured in the pre-tribulation rapture, which is the last event before the tribulation period begins. We don't know exactly when that will occur. Jesus told us to look up. Your redemption draws nigh. He says if the homeowner had known the thief was coming, he would have prepared for it. But he wasn't aware that the thief was coming, and we should be aware that Jesus is coming for the church of believers. We just don't know when he's coming. So let's get ready and be ready. We've been looking at the movement in our society today around the world for government movement, government control, in other words. They're making decisions for us to get us through life. We seem to be turning to the government all the time. In fact, this podcast I've entitled it, Just Call on the Government. Just call on the government. The reason for that is the Antichrist is setting things in motion early. It's like the pre-opening night presentation of the play. They have weeks and weeks and weeks of rehearsals and planning and dry runs and so on and so forth to make sure they got everything down and they've got it in order. So it's as if all these things are being put into order before we actually get there. And we're getting closer to it. So let me share a few things with you in this podcast today. There's a massive shift in our thinking today to rely on the government to solve most of our problems for us. We want them to do it with our pension plans. We want them to do it with our health plans. We want them to remind us about everything else that we should be doing through various service agencies. We have one called Service Ontario. We have another one called Service Canada. They look after most things for us to remind us, oh, you got to do this, you got to do that, got to get things done. But we found out yesterday that about 8% of the world's population are in a free and fair democratic society with free and fair elections. But that means about 92% of the world's under some form of authoritarian or dictatorial type control. Those are huge, massive numbers. The problem we're running into is our political system has shifted and changed so much from the way in which they govern. Now they're more interested in responding to the special interest groups. And the special interest groups have gained tremendous amount of influence and control over people. And in so doing, they're pushing us around and our governments around. And we have a second thing occurring in our governments today called an all or nothing rule. That is, you're elected and you're part of the majority party in the government. Well, you'll do exactly as the leader says. So if the leader says we're going to vote this way, you don't have a choice. You vote along the party line or else you're kicked out of the party or you're sidelined or you're relegated to a minor position. So the all or nothing party rule has become very, very significant in our governments. These are two factors, special interest groups and all or nothing, which lead us into situations where we just are we're told to, do what you're told. Do what you're told. COVID-19, the pandemic, the virus hit us in March of 2020. And most people turn to the government instantly. What are we going to do? What are you going to do? How are you going to protect us? What are you going to do? And so they all of a sudden brought out all kinds of mandates. We had health officers saying, here's what you should do. Government said, yeah, you should do this. You better do this. You have to do this. You're going to be arrested if you don't do this. You can't gather together. You got to shut all these things down. I heard so many stories that were horror stories. It was absolutely amazing. And It just never made any sense whatsoever. I'll give you one illustration. My son and his family, they had to attend a family funeral in the States. They had to cross into the United States. Well, they were prohibited from crossing the border. And they sought, grace at the border. And after about a 30-minute discussion with the border official, the customs official, they were authorized by a supervisor to cross into the States and drive down to the family and be part of the funeral and help with the widow and so on and so forth. So they return home to Canada. They're crossing back into Canada. And they're told, well, you now have to quarantine for 2 full weeks, and you cannot leave your home during that 2 weeks of quarantine because that's the rule. So they were aware of that. They said, yes, we understand. So then they were asked the question, who's going to bring groceries to your home? And they answered that we would. The parents, grandparents, we'd bring the groceries. So here were their instructions. You're not allowed to open the front door to receive the groceries. They have to be placed on your front step. Once your parents are back in their vehicle, you can open the door and pull the groceries into the house, but not until they're safely inside of their vehicle with the windows up. They're not allowed to talk to you from the car to the house. They have to have their windows up. They can't talk to you. That would be a violation of the quarantine rules. They can't even phone you. That would be a violation of the quarantine rules. And my son must have questioned that, and they said, well, if they were to park on the other side of the street, instead of your side of the street, if they were on the other side of the street, then they could use their phones and phone you. That would not violate the visitation rule. Can you help me understand why that makes any sense? None whatsoever. Then a few days later, they got a phone call from an official wanting to ask them questions about their quarantine compliance. And the first question they asked was, may we speak to your 6-year-old son? No. So they answered the questions for the 6-year-old. An hour later, they phoned a second time to talk to the 5-year-old daughter. No, can't talk to her. So they answered the questions for them. Identical questions, identical spiel, 2 different officers calling. An hour and a half, 2 hours later, they got a third call to talk to the baby. The baby was like 1.5 years old. And they said no, so they answered the very same set of questions. I hope I'm not boring you with this. This is real. This is actually what happened. They then called to talk to my daughter-in-law. She answered the same questions she had answered for the 2 older children. And then the last call was to my son. That came about 4 hours after the first call, or 5 hours after the first call. The same set of questions he answered for the baby. And tell me how that makes any sense. Well, what I'm getting at is it makes no sense. But we become dependent on our government. So look at health care. In our nation, in the U.S., things like Medicare and our health plans, the government's in charge of them. The government provides for our health care in that respect. They have limits. They tell you what you can have done, what you can't have done, and what they'll spend on it and what they won't spend on it. They won't allow us in Canada, or at least here in Ontario, they will not allow us to have any private health care provision whatsoever because they don't control that. So our health care is somewhat free, if not completely free, almost completely free. That seems to be a great blessing, except for the fact that it's so backed up. We wait a year, maybe 2 years for some procedures. Many people die before the procedure can be done. So my point is simply this. It's not to be disrespectful or derogatory. It's to tell you that when we are in these last days and we're heading towards an Antichrist rule, the system being set up to practice how it will work now has been for some time, and it's getting ready for the Antichrist to come on the scene. So don't tell me that we have all the time in the world before anything happens. Don't tell me that, because I'm living through the preliminary stages of it, and so are you. We just have to open our eyes to it. The time is short. Things are going to change. I'll see you tomorrow.